I am 71 years old, and I have spent most of those years behind a counter watching people come through a door. You learn things doing that. You learn that the people who talk the most when they enter a store are usually the ones who have thought the least about what they came for. You learn that the people who go straight to the shelf they need, take what they require, and bring it to the counter without browsing have generally done their thinking before they arrived. And you learn, this one takes longer, that the people who stand quietly at the counter while someone else does the talking are very often the most interesting people in the room if you have the patience to wait for them to become visible. Nora Lindqvist became visible to me over a period of 2 years. By the time I understood what I was looking at, she had already built something that most of the town of Redfield, Nebraska had told her was impossible, unnecessary, and probably evidence of a grief-damaged mind. The town was wrong on all 3 counts, and I was among those who were wrong, which is part of why I am telling this now. My granddaughter Clara has been asking me for the better part of a year to set down what I remember about the Lindqvist method and the woman who made it. The Nebraska Historical Society, she tells me, wants accounts from people who were present in the Republican River Valley during the settlement years, before the people who remember those years are gone. I have resisted this request longer than I should have, for reasons I will explain before I am finished. But it is the autumn of 1893, and Nora has been dead 2 years, and the people who knew the actual events are fewer each season, and so I am doing it now. I want to begin where I think the story truly begins, which is not with Nora at all. It begins with the problem she solved. And to understand the problem, you need to understand what winter meant in the Republican River Valley before anyone had worked out how to live there the way it needed to be lived in. The valley was not the treeless high plains that travelers wrote about in their eastern newspapers with such confident despair. We had cottonwood along the riverbanks, substantial timber if you knew where to look, elm in the draws, some oak on the higher ground to the east, willow thickets along any tributary worth the name. A family that worked steadily through summer and into fall could cut and split a winter's worth of fuel from what the land offered. This was the understanding that most settlers arrived with, and it was not wrong exactly. It was simply incomplete in ways that the first hard winter usually made plain. Cottonwood burns fast. It is a generous tree in its way. It grows quickly, splits cleanly, catches without much persuasion, but it gives up its heat in a rush and leaves you with a cold hearth faster than you expect. Elm burns longer and holds heat better, but elk was not always close, and the cutting and splitting of it was considerably harder work. Most families burned a mixture through the cold months, cottonwood and elm for the daytime fire, twisted hay bundles to bank the coals at night, dried buffalo chips as a reserve for the deep cold of February when everything else ran short. A careful family needed a minimum of 4 cords of properly split, properly dried wood to carry through to April. 4 cords was sufficient in an ordinary winter. An ordinary winter in the Republican River country was not what came every year. The wood that families cut through summer needed to dry before it would burn with any efficiency. Freshly split cottonwood holds moisture the way a sponge holds water, and burning it green produces smoke in rough proportion to the heat it fails to produce. A properly dried piece of elm or cottonwood, split and seasoned through 4 or 5 months of summer air, burns cleanly. The smoke goes up the chimney as it should, the heat radiates outward as intended, and the fire serves its purpose without filling the cabin interior with the gray haze that settled into the low spaces of a room and stayed there, accumulating over hours of burning inadequate fuel, working its way into the lungs of everyone breathing that air. People accepted this. That is the important thing to understand about those years in the valley and about frontier settlements generally in that period. People accepted conditions that would strike a later generation as obviously improvable, because acceptance was the practical posture of survival. You did not have the resources to solve every problem. You solved the ones that were immediately fatal, and you managed the ones that were merely miserable. Smoky fires in February were miserable. They were not, in the ordinary run of a winter, immediately fatal. And so they were managed rather than solved, year after year, until a winter came along that reclassified them. The wood, once dried, needed to stay dry. This was where the management usually broke down. Most families stacked their fuel against the south wall of their cabin or in a lean-to structure built from whatever lumber remained after construction. Lean-to structures on the open Nebraska plains are subject to the wind in ways that the word lean-to does not fully communicate. The wind that came off the high country to the west in November and January was not the blustering wind of an Ohio winter or an Illinois cold snap. It came in long, sustained pushes that did not gust and subside, but pressed continuously, finding every gap in every structure that was not built to the standard of a proper enclosed building. Canvas covers anchored with poles and stones lasted through ordinary weather and failed in storms. Lean-to roofs admitted ice in wind-driven sheets that no amount of careful nailing prevented. Wood stacked against a cabin wall collected snow at its base that melted in the brief warm intervals between storms and refroze and worked moisture upward into the stack from below, so that the bottom third of any outdoor woodpile was effectively wet from November onward, regardless of what covered the top. By February, in most years, every family in the valley was burning wood that was at least partially compromised. They compensated by burning more of it. They coughed from the extra smoke and attributed the coughing to winter air. They accepted it as the condition of the life they had chosen, the way they accepted mud in spring and heat in August. It was the price of the frontier, and the frontier charged it every year, and no one had yet thought to question whether the price was necessary. Nora Lindqvist thought to question it. But I am ahead of myself. The Lindqvists came into my father's store on the 14th of May, 1854, which I remember specifically because my father wrote the date in his ledger with a note that read, "New claim, River Bottom, South Quarter, Swedes, Lars, and Nora appear sound." My father assessed every new settler who came through his door in these practical terms. Sound meant they had enough money to establish themselves without extending credit beyond what he could reasonably expect to recover, and that they seemed to have the physical capacity and practical disposition that the country required. He was right about the Lindqvists on both counts, though the ways in which he was right were not the ways he had in mind when he wrote the word. Lars was a large man, fair-haired in the Swedish fashion, with the kind of hands that suggested he had been doing physical work since he was old enough to hold an implement, and a disposition that managed to be both patient and alert in a combination that is rarer than it sounds. He did most of the talking that first day, which was the custom, and he spoke English that was heavily accented but precise. He had learned it from a dictionary on the crossing and had the vocabulary of someone who had read more than he had spoken. He asked about timber quality on the river bottom, about the nearest sawmill and its prices, about which of the neighboring claims were reliably occupied and which had been abandoned. He was gathering information in the systematic way of a man who had already made his decision and was now filling in the details that decision required. Nora stood at the counter beside him and said almost nothing, which I noticed because I was 18 and inclined to notice things about people my own age, and she appeared to be close to my own age. She was smaller than Lars by nearly a foot, dark-eyed in contrast to his fairness, with the kind of stillness that reads as shyness until you pay attention to the eyes. Her eyes were not still. They were moving across my father's shelves in a continuous, methodical survey that went from left to right, top to bottom, and then back again to certain items she had marked on the first pass. She was reading the prices, I understood later. She was making a list in her head of what things cost in this particular store, in this particular settlement, comparing the prices against what she had expected, noting the items that were cheaper than she had planned for, and the items that were more expensive, and constructing from this information a revised account of what their first season would require and what it would cost. She bought exactly what she had come for and not one item beyond it. She thanked my father in English that still carried Sweden in the vowels, and went out to the wagon where Lars was already loading the lumber and hardware. I watched her walk across the yard, and I thought, that woman is calculating something. I did not know then what kind of mind calculated everything it encountered and what it would eventually produce. I would understand it fully 2 years later at considerable cost to my own early assumptions. The winter of 1855 into 1856 arrived early, which old-timers in the valley read in the behavior of the animals and the particular quality of the October air, and which my father recorded in the store ledger with the plain notation, "Earliest freeze in memory." Lars Lindqvist had spent the summer building their cabin, solid cottonwood log construction with good chinking and a stone hearth that drew cleanly, and the fall cutting and splitting their fuel supply and stacking it against the south wall beneath a heavy canvas cover that he had anchored with poles driven into the ground and stones placed at the corners and along the edges. I know about those stones because Nora told me about them years afterward. Lars had spent an extra hour with those stones, more than was strictly necessary, she said. He had selected them from the river bottom specifically for their size and flatness, carried them up from the water in 2 loads, and placed them with attention to their weight distribution along the canvas edges. She had watched him do this and had noted that he was being careful, more careful than the task appeared to require. She had thought, at the time, that this was one of the things she had understood correctly about him when she decided to cross an ocean in his company. The canvas blew free in the first 4 hours of the November storm, stones and all, and was carried into the prairie where they never found it. Careful, she told me, had not been enough. She did not say this with bitterness. She said it with the precision of someone who has reviewed an event until all the emotion has been replaced by understanding, and who finds the understanding more useful than the emotion ever was. Lars had a chest that had troubled him since the Atlantic crossing. Not a serious affliction in ordinary conditions, he always said, and Nora did not argue with him about it because there was nothing practical to argue toward. The nearest physician was in Omaha, 2 days by fast horse in summer and unreachable in any real winter. And a man's chest condition was a fact to be managed rather than a problem to be solved by anyone in the Republican River Valley in 1855. He managed it through the autumn without difficulty. He managed it through the first weeks of the November storm, when the canvas went and the woodpile packed with ice, and they began the slow, exhausting routine of digging wood from frozen accumulation and carrying it inside to dry near the fire before it could be burned. The fire that winter smoked more than it should have. Not catastrophically, they were not burning green wood, only wood that the storm had compromised, and there is a range of quality between properly seasoned dry fuel and truly green wood that produces not a roaring dark smoke, but a persistent gray haze, thin enough to seem manageable, present enough to accumulate. Nora managed the draft as best she could. She opened the cabin door to clear the air and closed it again before too much cold entered. She added kindling when the fire threatened to smolder. She burned with the care of a woman who understood that the fuel supply was finite and that February was still ahead. Lars began coughing in earnest on the 2nd of January, 1856. I will not describe those weeks at length. They have been described to me by Nora herself. In that careful, factual way she described things that had cost her greatly, and what she communicated was not drama, but arithmetic. The fire needed tending every hour. The wood required drying time. It did not always get. The smoke that the imperfect fuel produced was thin but continuous. The chest that had been managed through 2 Atlantic crossings and 3 years of frontier winters was finally not manageable anymore, because 3 weeks of inadequate air in an enclosed cabin had removed the margin that was keeping it in the manageable category. Lars Lindqvist died on the 23rd of January, 1856. He was 34 years old. Nora buried him on the 1st of March when the ground had thawed enough to accept him. She marked the grave with a cottonwood cross she carved herself, and spent that evening alone in the cabin, which was quiet, in the way that a space is quiet when it has held someone dying and now holds only the person who is still alive. She came into the store on the 14th of May, 1856. Exactly 2 years to the day after she and Lars had first walked through that door, though I do not believe the date was intentional. She needed lumber, hardware, and nails in a quantity that made my father set down his ledger and ask her to repeat the list. She repeated it without alteration. She explained what she intended to build, an enclosed fuel storage structure, approximately 24 feet long and 14 feet wide, connected to the south wall of her cabin by a covered passage 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. The storage structure would hold her entire winter fuel supply under a weatherproof roof elevated from the ground, accessible from inside the cabin without stepping into open weather. The passage was the essential element, a covered connection between her warm cabin and her dry wood supply, so that she could reach her fuel at any hour of any night in any storm without putting on her boots or opening an exterior door. My father sold her what she asked for. He also, that evening at supper, mentioned the transaction to my mother with an expression that communicated clearly what he thought of it, though he was too careful a businessman to have communicated it to Nora directly. By the end of the week, everyone in Redfield knew that the Lindqvist widow was building some sort of connected storage structure south of her cabin that would cost more than she could sensibly afford, take longer than the summer allowed, and solve a problem that a properly built woodshed would have addressed at half the expense. The explanation the town settled on was the one communities generally settle on when a person in grief undertakes something large and unconventional. The loss had altered her judgment, and someone ought to speak to her before she wasted Lars's savings on a project born from sorrow rather than sense. Thomas Hagen, whose claim bordered hers to the north and who had survived 12 Nebraska winters by trusting his own careful judgment above all other guides, rode over on the first Thursday of June. He was not an unkind man. He sat at her table and spoke to her as one practical person addresses another practical person whom he believes has temporarily lost access to their own practicality. He told her the structure she was describing would take most of the summer to build alone, which was accurate. He told her the materials cost was substantial for a widow without a second income, which was also accurate. He told her that a proper woodshed with a tight roof and solid walls would serve her adequately through any winter, which was his honest assessment based on 12 years of experience, and which was the place where his accuracy ran out. Nora thanked him for his concern. She was already staking out her foundation lines when he rode away. Sarah Pennock, who managed the dry goods side of her husband's establishment and who was the closest thing Redfield had to a community conscience in those years, told my mother that someone ought to speak to Nora before the construction went any further. My mother, who had a better eye for character than most people I have known in 71 years, said that in her observation, Nora Lindqvist was not a woman whose decisions came from grief. She was a woman whose decisions came from looking very carefully at what had happened and working out how to prevent it from happening again. My mother said there was a difference, and that she thought Redfield would benefit from waiting to see which one this was before drawing conclusions. Most of Redfield did not wait. Most of Redfield had drawn its conclusions already. I was among them. I am not proud of this, but I am telling you what was true. What I did not understand then, and would not understand until the winter that was coming had come and gone and done what it did, was that Nora Lindqvist had already settled the question in her own mind before she walked through my father's door. She was not building to convince anyone. She was not building to answer the town's doubts, or honor Lars's memory, or prove that a widow could manage a frontier claim alone. She was building because the calculation was clear and the need was real, and she had found, in the weeks after she put Lars in the ground, that there was a way to prevent the chain of events that had killed him, and that she was the person who was going to build it. We were, all of us, Thomas Hagen, Sarah Pennock, my father, myself, entirely beside the point. It would take a winter to teach us that. And the winter, as it happened, was already on its way. I want to tell you how the idea came to her, because this is the part of the story that people most often get wrong when they repeat it. The version that circulated through Redfield in later years, after the method had spread and the winter had proven it, and Thomas Hagen had become its most vigorous advocate, was that Nora Lindqvist sat down one evening after Lars's burial and worked out on paper the precise engineering solution to the firewood storage problem, the way a trained architect works out a building before a single post is set. This version flatters the story by making it neater than it was. It also misrepresents the kind of mind Nora had, which was not the mind of a person who derived solutions from abstract principles, but the mind of a person who noticed things, specific, physical, concrete things, and held the noticing in memory until the noticed thing became useful. The idea did not come from paper. It came from a washboard on a March morning and from water. She had told me this herself in the precise way she told things that mattered to her. It was the first week of March, 1856, and she was washing Lars's clothes. She had not yet decided what to do with them, whether to keep them or give them away, or set them aside for a season while the decision became clearer, but in the meantime they needed washing. She was standing at the washboard inside the cabin, working with water she had melted from snow she brought in from outside, because the outdoor water barrel was frozen solid in its wooden housing beside the cabin's east wall. She had been doing this since January, bringing snow inside to melt because the outdoor water was unreachable without significant effort and cold exposure, while the indoor water was simply there, warm and available, within 3 steps of wherever she needed it. She was working the washboard and not thinking about anything in particular, which is the condition under which certain kinds of minds make their clearest connections when the obvious parallel arrived. The outdoor water barrel was frozen and required work to reach. The indoor water was warm and required nothing. These were the same barrel of water. The only difference between them was the wall of the cabin standing between the outside air and the inside air, and the few degrees of warmth that wall preserved on the interior side of itself. The water that was inside was accessible. The water that was outside was not. The wood that was outside required bundling into heavy clothing and walking into cold and digging through snow and carrying back to the hearth. The wood that was inside, what remained of their supply that she had brought in to dry, required only bending down and picking it up. She stopped moving the shirt she was washing against the board. The wood needed to be inside, not in a shed attached to the outside of the cabin, not under a canvas cover 20 yards from the door. Inside or connected to the inside in such a way that reaching it was functionally equivalent to reaching for something in the next room. The problem was not that she needed a better exterior structure to protect the wood from weather. The problem was that the wood was on the wrong side of the wall. She finished the washing and hung the shirt to dry near the hearth and spent the remainder of that morning not doing anything that would have looked like design work to anyone watching. She was walking from the cabin door to the approximate location of her woodpile and counting her steps, 12 steps, in the snow across open ground. She was looking at the south wall of the cabin and calculating what would be required to attach a structure to it, a covered structure, a truly enclosed structure with a connecting passage that would make those 12 steps into 3 steps taken in indoor clothing on a dry floor. She was thinking about how large the storage space would need to be to hold everything a single person required through a Nebraska winter, and what the dimensions of such a space would mean in terms of the lumber and hardware required to build it. She walked to the south wall and put her hand flat against the logs. On the other side of those logs, the cabin was 52 degrees, which she knew because she had a small thermometer Lars had brought from Ohio. On this side of the logs, it was 11 degrees, and there was a wind from the northwest. One wall's thickness separated functional warmth from functional cold. The principle extended in both directions. A second wall, built 6 feet south of this one, connected at each end to create a passage, would trap 52-degree air in the passage space between them. A storage structure attached beyond the passage would benefit from the warmth the passage held, and from the shelter of its own walls, and from a roof that she was already beginning to design in her head, a roof that would have to be genuinely weatherproof, not lean-to weatherproof, because she was not building this to manage the problem. She was building it to end the problem. She went back inside and got her small brown notebook, the one she kept accounts in, and turned to the back pages where the account columns did not reach, and she began to draw. The drawings that Nora kept in that notebook were not the refined architectural sketches of someone trained in design. They were working drawings, dimensions annotated and then crossed out and replaced with corrected dimensions, structural problems identified in marginal notes, materials listed and relisted as her understanding of the construction developed. I have seen this notebook. Thomas Hagen's family donated it to the Historical Society in 1902, and my granddaughter Clara showed me a transcription of the pages last spring, and I recognized in them exactly the mind I had watched working from the time Nora first stood at my father's counter at the age of 22. She had divided the design problem into 3 components, each of which she worked through separately before connecting them. The first was the storage structure itself. She needed it large enough to hold 4 cords of split fuel. This was the number she had arrived at through her burn rate calculation, which I should describe briefly because it was not simple arithmetic. She had not merely counted the cords they had started with and estimated how many they had burned. She had calculated the difference in burn efficiency between dry wood and the compromised wood they had burned through January and into February. How much more volume of wet or partially wet wood was required to produce the same heat as properly seasoned dry fuel? The ratio was close to 2-to-1. A fire-burning compromised wood required nearly twice the volume to produce equivalent warmth. 4 cords of bone-dry fuel, she calculated, would do what 7 or 8 cords of their actual winter supply had struggled to do. 4 cords was her number, and the storage space needed to hold 4 cords with enough additional clearance for the organized arrangement she was already planning in her mind. Fuel separated by type, by burn characteristic, by the specific purpose each type served. The second component was the floor. This was the problem she thought through longest and with the most revision in the notebook margins. She had watched 2 Nebraska winters compromise wood stacks from below as well as from above, the ground moisture that wicked upward into the base of any stack sitting in contact with the earth, particularly during the freeze and thaw cycles of November and March, when temperature changes moved moisture through the soil in ways that defeated any surface-level waterproofing. The floor of the storage structure needed to be elevated, not dramatically. She had no interest in engineering complexity for its own sake, but by enough to interrupt the wicking path completely. She settled on 6 inches, supported by a grid of cottonwood crosspieces, creating a platform on which the fuel would rest entirely clear of the ground surface. Air would move freely beneath the platform. Moisture would not move upward through it. She wrote 6 inches minimum in the notebook and underlined it twice, which was how she marked conclusions she had tested enough to trust. The third component was the roof, and this was where the notebook showed the most revision because this was the component for which the standard frontier solutions, rough-sawn lumber, shingle courses, canvas over a frame, were demonstrably inadequate. She had watched too many lean-to roofs fail in various ways to believe that any version of the same approach would serve her differently. She needed something better than a shed roof, and she needed it to be something she could build alone with the materials available to her in this particular landscape. The answer came not from the notebook, but from the river bottom. She had been walking along the riverbank in early April, in the first genuinely warm days after the snowmelt, when she noticed, as she had noticed in the previous autumn, and filed under things that might one day be useful. How the bark on the fallen cottonwood trees along the bank shed water. Not the rotting wood beneath the bark, which was soft and wet and useless, the bark itself. It lay against the decomposing wood in overlapping natural courses, and the rain that had fallen the previous evening was beating on its outer surface and running off in thin, clear lines, and the wood immediately beneath it was dry to the touch, even where the surrounding ground was saturated. The bark had been doing this for however many years the tree had been down, and it showed no signs of stopping. She pulled a piece free and examined it. Cottonwood bark is flexible in a way that other bark is not. It bends without splitting, which means it conforms to a surface rather than cracking away from it. She thought about elm bark, which split in cold in ways she had observed on the elm rounds she had split for firewood, the bark separating from the wood in brittle sheets when the temperature dropped. Cottonwood bark did not do this. She had seen cottonwood bark on trees long dead, and it remained intact while the wood beneath it was already halfway to soil. She took several pieces home and laid them on the cabin floor and studied them for 2 evenings. Then she designed her roof, a base layer of split cottonwood boards nailed across the rafters, a middle layer of overlapping cottonwood bark slabs laid like shingles and cut at the lower edge to direct water cleanly to the piece below, and an outer layer of sod blocks pressed over the bark for weight and additional waterproofing, and the insulating mass that sod provided. 3 layers, each contributing what the others could not. The boards gave the structural surface. The bark provided the waterproofing that no board and seam construction could reliably maintain. The sod held the bark in place against wind and added a thermal mass that would keep the storage interior warmer than outside air even without a fire, which mattered for the structural timber over years of seasonal expansion and contraction, and which meant the passage connecting the storage to the cabin would not be a passage between warm and bitterly cold, but between warm and merely cool. She wrote in the notebook, "Bark from cottonwood only. Elm bark splits in hard cold. Pine resin becomes brittle at low temperature and fails at the seams. Cottonwood bark holds." She began digging foundation holes on the 10th of June. The work required a post-hole digger borrowed from my father and returned each evening before dark, cleaned and with the blade resharpened where the rocky subsoil had dulled it. She dug each hole to 3 feet, which was the depth required to reach solid earth below the frost line. Above that depth, the seasonal freeze and thaw of the Nebraska ground would move a post slowly over years until a structure built on it was no longer the structure that had been designed. Below 3 feet, the earth held still. She had learned this by asking Thomas Hagen, who had 12 years of experience in this ground, and who answered her specific question about frost depth in the practical way he answered any practical question, without realizing that the information he was providing was being incorporated into the project he had already advised her against undertaking. The holes were hard going. The soil in the river bottom was good agricultural earth for most of its depth, but at 2 feet it encountered a layer of compressed clay and stone aggregate that resisted the post-hole digger in a way that required the additional force of a steel bar she had, driving it into the resistance and working it loose before the digger could clear the material. Her hands blistered through the first week, and she bandaged them with strips of canvas and continued. The blistered skin hardened to callus by the second week, and the work went somewhat faster. She had set 11 of the 16 perimeter posts by the first week of July when she encountered the problem that required her first significant design revision. The southeast corner of the structure's planned footprint sat on ground that was softer than the surrounding area, a buried seam of old river deposit, she believed, that had never fully consolidated. She set the post, tamped the surrounding earth, and checked it the following morning with the plumb line she had made from a stone tied to a length of string. The post had settled 1/4 of an inch out of vertical overnight. She pulled it, dug the hole 18 inches deeper to reach the firmer substrate below the soft deposit, and reset it with an additional 6 inches of rock tamping at the base. Thomas Hagen came by that afternoon and found her kneeling beside the reset post, checking the plumb line for the third time since morning. He asked what she was doing. She said the post had settled, and she had dug it deeper, and she was confirming that the correction had held. He looked at the post. He looked at the plumb line hanging perfectly vertical against it. He looked at the other 15 posts standing in their precise formation around the structure's outline, each one checked and rechecked to the same standard. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was revising an opinion. He said it looked like careful work. She said it needed to be careful work. A post that was a quarter degree out of vertical would compound through every beam and rafter set above it, until the structure at its top was measurably out of true. She could not afford to build on a crooked foundation. Everything that came after depended on what she put in the ground now. He nodded slowly, as a man nods when he recognizes that the person he is speaking with understands something he had not previously credited them with understanding. He did not offer to help. She had not asked for help, and the frontier code that Thomas Hagen lived by did not extend to offering assistance that had not been requested, particularly to someone who had declined his advice on the larger project. But he stayed for perhaps another half hour, walking the perimeter of the staked foundation, checking his eye along the post lines, and when he left, he did not look back at the structure the way a man looks back at something he expects to fail. He looked back at it the way a man looks back at something he has decided to pay attention to. I know this because I was there that afternoon, delivering a package of hardware Nora had ordered from the store. I watched Thomas Hagen ride north toward his own claim, and I watched Nora return to her notebook and make 3 small notations about the post-depth revision, the cause of the settlement, and the corrective measure she had applied. She wrote down the error, and she wrote down the fix, and she wrote down the reason for the fix. That was what the notebook was. Not a record of what had gone right, a record of what she had learned, including from the things that had gone wrong. I did not understand its value at the time. I would understand it much later when Thomas Hagen sat at her table and she opened it between them and went through every page. The foundation posts stood by mid-July, 16 of them, set in the ground below the frost line, checked against the plumb line until each one was precisely vertical, tamped with stone and compacted earth until not one of them would move by a fraction of a degree before the first freeze came. On a July evening, with the sun going down behind the river cottonwoods and the posts standing in their formation like a carpenter's idea of order, imposed on the Nebraska prairie, Nora Lindquist walked the perimeter of what she was building and confirmed one more time that the foundation was sound. She was building on solid ground. Everything that came next would depend on that fact. The framing went up through July and into August, and the town of Redfield watched it the way a town watches anything it has already formed an opinion about, with the particular attention of people who expect to be proven right and are beginning slowly to be less certain that they will be. My father had predicted, when Nora first laid out her materials list, that a structure of those dimensions would require 3 experienced men most of a summer to frame properly. He was not wrong about the labor. He was wrong about what one woman working alone, methodically, from first light to last, could accomplish when she had thought through every step of the work before she began it. By the end of July, the horizontal support beams were in place, connecting the vertical posts in a skeleton that rose 9 feet above the Nebraska ground with a squareness that the carpenters who stopped to look at it could not find fault with. The corner joints were notched and pegged, not merely nailed, each beam seated into a cut recess in the post face so that the joint bore its load through wood contact rather than fastener tension. This was the technique used in proper timber framing, which Nora had studied by examining the construction of the feed barn that the Reimer family had raised the previous spring, asking Agnes Reimer enough questions about the framing technique that Agnes had eventually introduced her to the carpenter who had overseen the work. He had answered her questions with the slightly surprised thoroughness of a craftsman who recognizes that the person asking is actually listening. I asked Nora once whether she had been afraid during the beam raising, whether the work of managing heavy timber alone, with only a rope and pulley arrangement and her horse for mechanical advantage, had produced the kind of fear that a reasonable person would feel under those circumstances. She considered the question for a moment. Then she said that she had been afraid of one specific thing, which was not the timber falling, but the horse moving at the wrong moment. The timber, properly rigged, would do what the rigging directed it to do. The horse had its own opinions. She had solved this by spending 3 evenings before the first beam raise working with the horse in the specific configuration the rigging required, asking it to hold a steady pull, to stop on her signal, to hold position while she moved, until the horse understood what was expected of it. By the time the first beam went up, the horse was a reliable component of the system. The timber was not the variable. She had controlled the variable. This was, I came to understand, how Nora Lindqvist thought about most problems. Identify the variable, control it, proceed. The roof presented the hardest problem of the construction, and the one that came closest to defeating her, not through any failure of design, but through the particular hostility that late August sometimes shows toward outdoor construction work in the Nebraska country. She had begun installing the base layer of split cottonwood boards across the rafters in the 3rd week of August, nailing them in tight overlapping courses from the low south eave to the high north edge, where the roof would meet the passage structure. The work went well for 4 days. The boards went down straight and tight, and the surface they created was solid enough to walk on, which she tested by putting her own weight on the center rafter, all of it standing fully upright before she committed to the bark layer. If the framing held her, it would hold the sod. The framing held her without protest. She began cutting bark from the dead cottonwood trees along the river bottom on the 22nd of August, selecting pieces of consistent thickness and suitable width, rejecting any piece that showed cracking along the inner surface or that flexed unevenly under hand pressure. She made her first error on the 2nd day of cutting, when she worked her way along the bank to a stand of dead elm that offered larger pieces in better condition than the cottonwood she had been harvesting. She cut a full day's worth of elm bark and hauled it to the structure before she recognized the problem. She had laid 3 courses of elm bark on the completed board surface when she stopped and pulled one piece free and held it in her hands and bent it, once, carefully, and then again, more sharply. The elm bark flexed on the first bend and developed a hairline fracture along its inner face on the second. Not a full split. Not yet. But the material was telling her what it would do in a January freeze, when the temperature dropped to 20 below and the bark contracted, and the hairline became a channel, and the channel let water through. She pulled every piece of elm bark off the roof that afternoon. She hauled it back to the riverbank and cut cottonwood to replace it, which added a day and a half to the schedule. She made a note in the back of the notebook: elm bark fails in hard cold, fractures on contraction. Cottonwood bark holds. Do not substitute. This was the way the notebook grew, not from success, but from the small, precise failures that a careful person treats as information rather than defeat. The cottonwood bark went down over the following 3 days in overlapping courses, each piece angled to direct water cleanly to the lower edge of the piece below it, the bottom course overhanging the eave board by 4 inches to throw water clear of the wall framing. Thomas Hagen came by on the afternoon of the 2nd day and stood at the base of the roof ramp Nora had built for material access, looking up at the bark coursing with an expression I recognized from his visit to the foundation posts, the expression of a man updating a prior assessment. He said he had not seen cottonwood bark used that way before. She said she had not seen it done either. She had seen it do the work on its own terms, on the fallen trees along the river, and had decided to make use of what it already knew how to do. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was thinking rather than simply pausing. Then he asked how she had known the bark would hold at the seams when the courses overlapped, rather than wicking water through the joint by capillary action. She said she had cut a test section and poured water over it for 2 hours to see what it did. The water ran off. The seam underneath stayed dry. He asked when she had done this. She said April. She had been thinking about the roof in April. Thomas Hagen looked at the bark coursing on the roof for another long moment. I believe something shifted in his thinking on that afternoon that was more significant than anything he said before or after it. He had come to the project with the assumption that Nora was doing the best she could with limited knowledge and grief-impaired judgment, and that the best she could would prove insufficient when tested. What he was looking at on the roof was not the best she could do under difficult circumstances. It was the correct solution to a specific problem, arrived at through observation and testing 4 months before the problem needed solving, implemented with a precision that a trained carpenter would not have improved upon. He had been wrong about the category of thing this was. He was large enough to know it and honest enough to show it on his face, and not quite ready yet to say it out loud. He said it looked sound. She thanked him and went back to laying bark. On the 28th of August, 3 days before the sod layer was to go down, the rain came. Not the brief afternoon thunderstorms of high summer, which passed in an hour and left the air clean and the ground grateful. This was a sustained rain from the northeast, the kind that settles in for days with a patience that feels personal, and it arrived at 11 in the morning and showed no inclination to stop. By evening it had been raining for 9 hours, and the bark layer, complete, correctly coursed, the overlapping joints tight, was exposed to more sustained water than any test Nora had run in April could fully replicate. She stood inside the structure and watched. The board surface beneath the bark was dry. The bark was doing what it had done on the fallen trees along the riverbank, shedding water in thin running lines toward the south eave and throwing it clear. But the bark layer had no weight on it yet. The sod blocks that would hold it against wind, that would press the courses tight against each other and eliminate the small movements that could open a joint over years of temperature change, those were sitting in neat squares on the ground outside, cut and ready, and becoming increasingly saturated as the rain continued. She could not place the sod in this rain. Saturated sod blocks would add weight the rafter framing could support, but wet sod would introduce moisture into the system from above at the moment she was trying to seal the system against moisture from above. She needed the sod dry enough to place, and she needed to place it before a second rain came through and found a joint in the bark layer that the first rain had loosened. She spent the first day of rain covering the sod blocks with every piece of canvas she owned, weighting the edges with stones in the way Lars had weighted the canvas over the wood pile, thinking about that as she did it, and then not thinking about it and going on with the covering. She spent the second day inside the structure, checking the board surface beneath the bark every 2 hours for any sign of moisture penetration. She found none. She made note of the time of each check and the condition of the surface in the notebook. On the morning of the third day, the rain stopped. She had 4 hours, she estimated, before the sky to the northwest showed what it was planning next. She sent her horse at a fast walk to the Pennock claim. Sarah Pennock had been watching Nora's construction progress through the summer with a complicated mixture of feelings that I believe she sorted out fully only on that Saturday morning when she arrived with 2 other women, my mother and Agnes Reimer, and found Nora already on the roof positioning the first sod blocks into place alone, working with the focused speed of someone who understands exactly how much time she has. Sarah Pennock had organized the community concern about Nora's project in the early weeks of summer. She had visited, had spoken carefully, had suggested alternatives. She was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had learned to care for her community's members by attending to what the community's experience said was wise. And the community's experience said that a widow building alone was a widow building toward failure, and that the kindest response was to redirect the effort before the failure became costly. What she found on that August morning was not a widow building toward failure. What she found was a woman who had constructed a roof system that 3 days of sustained rain had failed to penetrate, who had cut and prepared enough sod to complete the final layer in a single day if she had enough hands, and who had asked for those hands in the most direct and practical terms possible. "Come now, work is needed. I have a narrow window before the next rain." The three women carried sod blocks up the access ramp, and Nora fitted each one into its position with rapid, precise attention, pressing each block firmly against the preceding course, checking the alignment, moving on. There was very little talking. The work did not require talking. It required carrying and placing, and the kind of focused physical effort that settles into a rhythm after the first hour and becomes almost meditative in its repetition. Sarah Pennock told me afterward that she had changed her mind about something during those hours on the roof, but that she was not entirely sure what the something was. I think what she changed her mind about was the category of thing Nora was doing. She had filed it under grief-driven excess, and the act of carrying sod blocks in support of a 3-layer waterproofing system that was already demonstrably working filed it somewhere else, somewhere that required more respect and less management. By late afternoon, the sod layer was complete. The northwest sky had gone the color of a bruise. The rain arrived at dusk and fell through the night, and by morning there was a 1/4 inch of water standing on the barn floor south of the structure and the board surface beneath the bark, and sod was as dry as it had been in July. September arrived and changed everything about the air. I have tried to describe the quality of a Nebraska September to people who have not experienced it, and I have not succeeded. So I will only say that the air in September in the Republican River Valley has a clarity to it that the air of no other month possesses, a cleanness and a coolness that arrives overnight one morning and does not leave, and that carries in it, if you have spent enough autumns in the country to read it, information about the winter ahead. The old-timers in Redfield read September air the way my father read a balance sheet. They looked at the woolly caterpillar bands and the behavior of the squirrels and the depth at which the hornets built their nests and the particular quality of the light on the river in the early morning, and from these things they made their assessments. The assessment in September of 1856 was that what was coming would be worse than what had come before. Thomas Hagan told me this on the 22nd of September, when he came into the store for his fall supplies. He said the signs were the clearest he had seen in 12 years of reading them. The caterpillars were nearly solid black. The squirrels along the river bottom were working with an urgency he had not observed in ordinary preparation years. The hornets had built deep into the ground, which they were said to do when they anticipated a winter that would require depth for warmth. He had increased his own fuel preparations accordingly and had spoken to 2 other families who he thought might be underprepared. He paused in the doorway on his way out and said that he had ridden past the Lindqvist claim that morning and the storage structure was full. I asked how he knew it was full. He said he had looked through the passage entrance. The wood was stacked to the roof on 3 sides of the cabin. Every piece was inside. None of it was going to get wet. He said this in a neutral tone that was not quite neutral, and then he went out to his wagon. I went to the window and watched him drive north, and I thought about what he had said, and I thought about Lars Lindqvist's canvas cover weighted with river stones, and I thought about the particular quality of the September air coming through the window glass, and I understood with a clarity I had not felt before that the winter Thomas Hagan was describing was coming whether we were ready for it or not, and that readiness in the Republican River Valley in the autumn of 1856 was a more complicated question than any of us had been treating it as. Nora Lindqvist had understood this in March, when she was standing at a washboard with her husband's shirt in her hands. The rest of us were understanding it now, in September, with the signs already written in the air and the caterpillars and the behavior of the squirrels along the river bottom, and the winter still 6 weeks away and closing. The first snow fell on the 24th of October. Light flakes, the kind that melt before they accumulate, lasting perhaps 2 hours in the afternoon and leaving nothing behind but wet ground and the smell of cold air that had been somewhere colder before it arrived here. Nora watched it from the passage window, She had cut a small opening in the passage's east wall and fitted it with oiled cloth, not glass, which let in light and a muted view of the landscape without the expense of actual glazing. She watched the flakes fall and melt and fall again, and she went back to the cabin and built up her fire with a piece of dry elm she had carried in from the storage structure in less time than it takes to describe the act. November brought the cold that the September signs had promised, steady, resolved cold, the kind that arrives with the intention of staying. The temperature dropped below freezing on the 4th of November and did not rise above it for the remainder of the season. Families in Redfield settled into their winter routines, the constant tending of fires, the daily reckoning of fuel remaining against weeks remaining, the particular arithmetic of a Nebraska winter that everyone in the valley ran in the back of their minds from November to April like a clock they could not stop hearing. Nora's arithmetic was different from everyone else's. She knew her fuel supply precisely, 4 cords of split cottonwood and elm, organized on the elevated platform floor by burn characteristic, each section marked with charcoal on the floor joists. She knew her daily consumption rate, which she had tracked with the same notebook discipline she had applied to the construction. She knew with a certainty that no other family in the valley possessed that winter, that she had enough. The calculation resolved clearly every time she ran it. She had enough, and it was dry, and it was 30 steps from her hearth without ever opening a door to outside air. The storm that Thomas Hagen had read in the September Caterpillars arrived on the 18th of January, 1857. It began in the pre-dawn hours with a wind that woke me inside the store building, where my father and I had been sleeping since December rather than attempt the 1.5-mile road to our house on the north edge of town in conditions that made that road unreliable. I lay in the dark and listened to the wind find the gaps in the store's board siding, and I understood within the first minutes that this was a different order of storm from anything the previous season had produced. It lasted 51 hours. My father recorded the duration in the store ledger and underlined it twice, which was the only time in 20 years of ledger keeping I ever saw him underline anything twice. The temperature during the storm reached 23 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The wind drove the snow not in the vertical fall of ordinary storms, but in a horizontal sheet that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm and found every exterior surface of every structure in the valley and worked against it with a persistence that felt, in the small hours of the second night, almost deliberate. When the wind stopped on the morning of the 20th, I put on everything I owned that could be worn simultaneously and walked the settlement. My father had established this practice after our first hard winter. Someone walked to every homestead after each severe storm to confirm that no family was in immediate crisis. In most winters, the walk produced nothing worse than cold fingers and a few families low on fuel who could manage until conditions improved. On the morning of January 20th, 1857, the walk produced something different. The Reimer children, Agnes's 2 eldest, 9 and 11, were coughing when I came through the door. Not the dry cough of cold air, but the deeper, wetter sound that I had heard in other cabins in other winters and that I had learned to take seriously. Their fuel supply had been compromised in the storm's first hours, the canvas cover displaced by the same kind of wind that had taken Lars Lindqvist's canvas the previous year. They were managing. They were not in immediate crisis, but the air in the cabin held a grayness that I noted and did not say anything about because there was nothing useful to say. The Castellano cabin was the one that has stayed with me in the 37 years since. Marco Castellano had arrived from central Illinois the previous spring with his wife Maria and 3 children, the youngest of whom was 2 years old, and with the optimism of a man who had read about Nebraska homesteading in an Eastern newspaper and found the reading convincing. He was not a foolish man. He had prepared for winter with the information available to him, which was the same information available to most first-year settlers in the valley. Stack what you cut, cover it with canvas, plan for 4 cords, pray for an ordinary winter. He had done all of this. He had not been given an ordinary winter. When I opened the Castellano door, I found Maria standing at the hearth with the youngest child on her hip, and the two older children pressed close to her sides, and Marco feeding a kitchen chair into the fire. Not a broken chair, a whole chair, its legs sawn roughly to fit the firebox, the green cottonwood of which it was made burning with the reluctant smoke-heavy combustion of wood that has not dried and does not want to burn. The cabin air held the particular gray quality I had last encountered in the descriptions Nora had given me of the cabin in January of the previous year. I looked at the 2-year-old on Maria's hip, and I made a decision. I need to say something here that I have not said in any previous telling of this story, because it is not flattering to me, and I have had to live with it. I had sold the Castellano family their first season's supplies in the spring. I had not told them, with any adequacy, what a hard Nebraska winter required in terms of fuel preparation. I had given them the standard advice: 4 cords, good canvas cover, keep it stacked tight. And I had not told them that 4 cords assumed dry wood and a covered stack that stayed covered, and that the November storm of the previous year had defeated a covered stack belonging to a careful man who had spent an extra hour on his anchoring stones. I had not told them this because I had not thought to tell them, and I had not thought to tell them because I had accepted the standard advice as sufficient. In the same way, everyone in Redfield accepted the standard arrangements for firewood as sufficient. Nora had stopped accepting that sufficiency in March of the previous year. I had not stopped accepting it until I was standing in the Castellano cabin looking at a burning kitchen chair and a 2-year-old in a gray-aired room. I went to Nora's property at a pace that was as close to running as knee-deep snow permitted. She opened the passage door before I reached it. She had seen me coming from the oiled cloth window. I told her about the Castellanos. I told her about the Reimer children coughing. I told her there were 2 other families I had marked as marginal on my walk and not yet visited. She was already pulling on her coat. She had 3 cords remaining after 2 months of steady burning. She said this the way she said most things that mattered, without inflection, as information. She could give a cord to the Castellanos immediately and distribute among the others and finish the winter with surplus. She said there was no question about whether to do it. She said this also without inflection, as a statement of fact that required no discussion. We loaded the sledge together from the storage structure. I want to describe this accurately because the physical reality of it has stayed with me as clearly as anything else from that morning. Dry elm split stack with a particular satisfying firmness, each piece dense and uniform in weight, the surfaces clean, no give or softness to indicate residual moisture, no ice crystals in the grain. They load quickly because they are exactly what they are supposed to be. We filled the sledge in 10 minutes and pulled it to the Castellano cabin through snow that was difficult but passable. Maria Castellano watched us stack dry wood beside her hearth with an expression that I will not attempt to describe in detail because I do not have the English for it, or the Italian either. She said something quietly in a language I did not understand, and Nora nodded once, and that was the whole of what passed between them on the subject of what the wood meant and why it was there. Marco built a fire with the dry elm. It caught in 4 minutes. The flame was clear and high, and the smoke went straight up the chimney without hesitation, the way fire is supposed to behave when the fuel is what it is supposed to be. The cabin began to warm. The 2-year-old on Maria's hip stopped pressing his face into her shoulder and turned to look at the fire with the uncomplicated interest of a child for whom the immediate crisis has resolved. We brought wood to 2 more families before the light changed. Thomas Hagen came to the store in February and asked my father for the list of materials Nora had originally purchased. My father gave him the list and told him the more useful thing would be to speak with Nora herself. He visited her on a Wednesday morning, and she put the construction notebook on the table between them and went through every page. She showed him the errors, the elm bark, the southeast corner post, the floor clearance calculation she had revised twice before settling on 6 inches. She showed him the corrections and the reasons for the corrections. She held nothing back, which I note not because it was unusual for Nora, but because I have known people who worked as hard for knowledge and guarded it proportionally, and she was not among them. Thomas asked at some point in that conversation why she shared so freely when the information had cost her so much to develop. She said the information was not hers to keep, it was hers to figure out. There was a difference. 3 families in Redfield broke ground on connected storage structures before the spring thaw had fully cleared the south-facing slopes. Thomas Hagen's was the largest, adapted for his family's greater requirements. The Pennock structure was almost identical in dimension to Nora's original, which I mention because Sarah Pennock had been the first person in town to suggest that someone ought to intervene before Nora wasted Lars's savings on a project born from sorrow. I do not say this to diminish Sarah Pennock, who was a good woman and who lifted sod blocks on a rain-threatened August Saturday when it mattered. I say it because it is accurate, and because the distance between Sarah Pennock in May of 1856 and Sarah Pennock breaking ground in April of 1857 is itself a kind of history. I visited the original Lindqvist claim in the summer of 1893 before I sat down to write this account. The structure is still standing. August Svensson, whom Nora married in 1869 and who was, in my observation, exactly the right kind of man for her, practical, unhurried, capable of recognizing competence in the person beside him without requiring that the recognition diminish him, replaced the outer sod layer of the roof in 1871 after a particularly hard winter loosened the upper courses. He told me this when I visited, standing in the passage and running his hand along the cottonwood bark beneath where the sod had been. The bark layer itself he had not touched. The baseboards he had not touched. The elevated platform floor, the notched beam joints, the passage with its 6-foot width and its dry floor, all of Nora's original construction, unchanged across 37 years of Nebraska winters. I stood in the passage for a few minutes after August went back to the house. It was a warm July morning, and the passage was cool in the way that enclosed spaces are cool when they are separated from direct sun. I put my hand on the cottonwood bark along the roof support, dry to the touch, slightly cool. I picked up a small piece of split elm from the platform floor. The storage structure has been empty of fuel for some years, but the platform floor remains, the 6-inch clearance intact beneath it, and I held it for a moment. 37 years. She had built it in one summer, alone, from drawings made in the back of an account notebook on March mornings in the year her husband died. It had not failed. It had not leaked. It had not shifted on its foundation, or opened at its joints, or surrendered any element of its function to the slow pressure that 37 winters apply to everything built in this country. I set the elm piece back on the platform floor and walked out through the passage into the July morning. Nora Lindqvist died in the spring of 1891. She was 67 years old, which is a full life by any measure, and a longer life than Lars had, and longer than several of the families she helped through the winter of 1856 to 1857 ever reached. The church was full at her service, and some of the people who came had traveled distances that the occasion of a quiet woman's death would not ordinarily justify. I sat in the third row, and I looked at the people in the pews, and I thought about the notebook on the table, and the elm pieces stacking cleanly on the sledge, and Maria Castellano's expression when the fire caught. I have been asked what I think her legacy amounts to. It is a large word for a practical matter, and Nora would have had no patience for it. What I think is this. She looked at a problem that everyone around her had accepted as an unavoidable feature of the life they had chosen, and she refused the acceptance. She refused it not with anger or with the need to be recognized for refusing it, but with the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who had done the arithmetic and found that the answer was different from the one everyone else was carrying. She built the answer. She gave it away. She went on with her life. The impossible had become routine, and routine, on the frontier, was the highest form of survival. That is what I wanted to say. That is why I finally wrote it down. Harriet Bloom, Redfield, Nebraska, October 1893.